This may end up being one of those shorter episodes today. It's just me, no guest, and I'd like to share some reflections about the concept of detachment. Welcome to the Henny Flynn podcast, the space for deepening self-awareness with profound self-compassion. I'm Henny. I write, coach, and speak about how exploring our inner world can transform how we experience our outer world, all founded on a bedrock of self-love. Settle in and listen and see where the episode takes you. And we may well touch on the concept of clinging too, but I'd like to focus more on that intentional act of releasing, of letting things be. And I'm very mindfully using that phrase rather than letting things go. I think sometimes when we feel into this need that we have to detach, to create some space around us, we can get lost in the idea of what letting things go might mean. It can take us into a fear-based place, maybe a fear that we're going to be alone, maybe a fear of loss, a fear of grief, maybe a sense that we won't be enough if we let something go or let someone go. And so I prefer to use the phrase, let things be. And I also prefer it because in many ways, when we're thinking of releasing a behaviour or a belief that no longer serves us, or an old thought pattern, or something systemic from our family line, a way that our family tends to do things, think about things, feel about things, then those old patterns, those old ways of thinking, old ways of feeling, in my opinion, poll of one, my sense is that they never really disappear. Which doesn't mean that we can't learn to move forward from them or manage them or settle them in some way. But the very concept of the word trigger is something arising out of the blue, unexpectedly, in response to something else that happens. And if we think more about this phrase of letting things be rather than letting things go, it almost softens us into the potential that a trigger might occur. Something might suddenly arise. We might suddenly find ourselves re-entering an old pattern, an old way of thinking, an old way of feeling, an old way of doing. And kind of giving ourselves the space for that and accepting that's part of our humanness and accepting that we can move forward from that too. And of course, if you've been part of this beautiful community of podcast listeners here for a while, then you'll know that for me, compassion is really the most fundamental stance that we need to take in all things. And I think particularly when things are feeling tender or complicated in some way. So this idea of detachment, it's been showing up in a number of client conversations recently. And so I'm noticing that and I am responding to it because maybe it's showing up because, in some universal energetic pattern or a little wavelength of energy that's going through us. Maybe it's something that's useful for many more of us to consider this idea of detachment. And I think so often the reason why we don't, the reason why we cling to people, places, practices, ideas, is that we are seeking some sense of control. But as Tara Brach sort of often talks about, this is an illusion, the illusion of control. We all know deep in our hearts, deep in our most rational way of thinking, that control is something that is tenuous at best, and a far more useful way of being in the world is flow, allowing. What's his name? Michael. Someone remind me. Someone in my head remind me. The author of the Surrender Experiment. When we think about this idea of surrender and letting things be, letting things flow, we understand that it is so much healthier for our whole system to be in that place rather than in that illusion of control. So part of this work generally, work with a big, massive capital W, is to notice what's coming up for us. So as I say, I'm noticing this idea of detachment, and I've been reflecting on it myself as well. Like, why is this coming up for me? Not just for the people that I work with, because when I see a pattern to something coming up in client conversations, often, always, there is something in there that is really resonant for me personally. And, and I've talked before about how I learn something from every single person that I work with. Without fail, I learn something really important. And so it's a beautiful reciprocal process that we go through. So this morning, I drew an angel card. I've been returning to my meditation practice, to my much more consistent meditation practice, and with that, a much more consistent journaling practice as well. Journaling is something that I do a lot, but it become a bit more ad hoc. And so I'm really glad that I've sort of re-established a pattern of getting up before Anton, coming to the stable, sitting in front of my shrine, meditating, and then journaling. And I have returned right back to a practice that first helped me a few years ago when I first started really establishing these practices, and it was to draw an angel card. The ones that I have are the ones by Diane Cooper, and they're a set that I had at university and then rediscovered, sitting on a shelf as though they'd been there all the time. And and they're just a beautiful thing. So the card that I drew this morning was, of course, Detachment, and I'd love to read it to you. And what it says is, according to spiritual law, you can have anything your heart desires. However, if your happiness, sense of security, or feeling of power depends on someone or something in your life, then you are attached to that person or thing, and it is a chain which binds you to a lower frequency and keeps you stuck. Your guidance is to ask the angels to help you cut the cords that tie you to people, things, and emotions. When all attachments are released, you can no longer be manipulated emotionally. This enables you to reclaim your power and be genuine. Free your spirit and that of others. Let go now. And there's an affirmation that comes with this. I release everyone and everything. My spirit is free. Now, you might want to listen back to that. And if you're anything like me, there may be some aspects of it which jarred a little bit. Something about this idea of, when we're attached, we're bound to a lower frequency and it keeps us stuck. I think the other part that also sort of pulls me up short is this idea of cutting the cords that tie me to people, things, and emotions. But when we soften into those words, when we really listen to the deeper meaning within them, then we can see that this isn't about isolating ourselves or rejecting anyone or anything else. It's actually about establishing our boundaries, our energetic boundaries around us, and no longer being so dependent upon an other, whatever that other might be, for our well-being, our happiness, our joy. And it's about really standing very securely in our own space, and from there being able to fully love both ourselves and everyone and everything around us. And I think the line about free your spirit and that of others is very resonant here. There was something else that came up today, which was again another pointer that maybe this was a good topic to discuss or to explore, to meander through maybe, was a quote from Brené Brown, where she writes that the opposite of belonging is fitting in. I really love this. I love how succinct it is. It reminds me a little of the everyday compassion emails that I send out, these tiny drops of reflection that can help us shape our day in a more compassionate way. And this line from Brené it kind of feels very resonant with those. The opposite of belonging is fitting in. And I think this relates to this idea of detachment, because if we're so focused on our need to fit in, and it can be such a human desire to do that because we want to survive, we want to be accepted by the group. We're taught it from a very, very young age in our culture, our community, our religion, our family system. We're taught this is how you fit in. And it can feel like the opposite of belonging. I meet so many people who have a sense that they don't really know where their place in the world is, even though they come from a loving family and they've got a good friendship group and all of those things. But there isn't that deeper sense of belonging. And when we listen to any teacher like Ram Dass or any of the great teachers who help us sink a little bit deeper into what our own truth is, often our real sense of belonging is when we have come home to ourselves. And for me, I think that's part of what detachment enables us to do, to create this sense of spaciousness around us, where our energy isn't attached to any other one person or one place or one belief system. And we're more able to stand really fully in the space that we're all granted in this world. The moment we're born, we're given this beautiful space to inhabit. And many of us, it can take a long time, maybe lifetimes, to understand the size, the scope, the breadth and depth of the space we actually have that we can live into. There were some other thoughts that I had, but I kind of really feeling like the need just to end here. This is an art of detachment in itself, isn't it? I've got a few little bullet points on my screen in front of me as I'm talking to you, and actually I'm going to let those go, or rather let them be, and maybe they'll turn up in another episode somewhere down the line. In fact, I'm almost certain they will, actually. But I think the one last sort of thought that I had that I'd like to share is that sometimes it can be really useful to have a cue, maybe a word, maybe an image, maybe a physical movement, something that helps us notice and remember when we are in that place of clinging and where detaching could perhaps better serve us and those that we're with. And I say again, this isn't about isolating or separating. It's about really being able to let someone else be fully themselves and to let ourselves be fully ourselves. And for me, a word here that I find really useful, I think I've already mentioned it on this episode, is the word allow. To allow. Oh, when I breathe into that word, my body settles. I invite you to say it out loud, maybe now, if that's available to you, wherever you are. Just to really sink into what it means to allow. And when we allow, we lose our desire to control, to make things the way that we have decided, perceived, imagined that they must, ought, or should be. And we let them be. And that sense of allowing is something that resonates both in the concept of stuff that happens around us, but also within us. Allow, without judgment, without trying to force or change or control, but allowing. And I say here as well that this isn't a passive state. This is active inaction. This is giving ourselves a pause, a breath, to see what is really needing our attention right now, rather than just responding to that triggered response that we might have learnt somewhere in the history of our life. So, my darling, oh gosh, really enjoyed that. Hope you did too. And I am sending you a hug and a wave.